Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. Did I go to college? Well, for a while. Did I finish? No, I did not. Do I think it's necessary for your success? In some fields, it's absolutely essential. You want to be a doctor or a lawyer, an engineer, a nurse, you got to have the credentials. For an awful lot of other things, I don't think the money is there. And in fact, I can recall seeing comparisons of colleges around America where they said literally, go to school here, it's going to cost you $70,000 over 4 years, and when you're done, your average paycheck will be $2 an hour higher than you would have made otherwise. And you say, hold on, I don't think that pencils out. Even my math skills for that little bit of college I got would tell me that $2 an hour, $4,000 a year, $70,000 invested, probably not a good deal. But there's another reason why colleges may not be a good deal, and Preston Cooper knows all about it. He's a scholar with the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, and he joins me now. Preston, welcome to the program.
Hey, thank you for having me back.
So there's a thing called accreditation, which is a hard word to say, but it basically means you set up a college or a university or probably trade schools as well. If you don't have accreditation, then the students who go there can't get federal student aid, and it means they probably can't attend. But if you do get accreditation, it means that those students will be able to borrow money and get federal student aid, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they'll get a positive return on investment. Does that pretty well sum up the overview of what your study showed?
That's exactly right. So yeah, if you wanted to start Lars Larson University, you'd have to get recognition from an accreditor. And this is going to cost you probably $300,000 in total. It'll take 6 or 7 years to get that accreditation. And that accreditation isn't necessarily a great marker of quality. So my research that I've just put out a couple of weeks ago shows that all of the existing accreditors oversee hundreds of colleges where the degrees and certificates they're producing just don't have any labor market value, cost way too much, and don't deliver students the return that they're expecting. So accreditation really is the worst of both worlds. It's creating this barrier to entry. It's creating a barrier to starting new colleges to compete with the existing ones. And it's also not effectively ensuring quality because there are so many schools that are fully accredited that are still failing their students.
I got to ask you this, President, if you'll forgive this comparison. My audience knows I like crazy metaphors, but if I go to the grocery store, almost every kind of food I could buy has a label on it that tells me exactly what's inside, how much sodium, how much fat, how much sugar, what it does contain, sometimes even what it doesn't contain. There's none of this and there's none of that. But when you go to college, there's no way to find, is there a way to find out if I go to this college, whether you're the son or daughter going, or maybe it's mom or dad looking at schools on behalf of their kids, there's no way to find out, well, if I go here and spend all this money, will it actually turn out positively when it comes to the financial return?
That's right. So the colleges have every incentive to keep that information from you because there's a lot of programs where they're going to charge an arm and a leg for them. And the degree that you get just isn't going to have a whole lot of labor market value. It isn't going to earn you enough in order to earn back the cost of that education. The colleges certainly aren't going to tell you this. I think we should change that. But right now, if you're a student or you're a parent of a student, there are other resources you can go to try and figure out whether you're going to get a return on investment for your college education. You can go to the collegescorecard.ed.gov, which will allow you to see what your expected earnings are going to be. And you can also go check out my study at freop.org, freopp.org, which will tell you our estimates of whether we think each degree or certificate is going to pay off. But the colleges themselves, they're certainly not going to tell you that.
Let me ask you this, Preston. The accreditors, do they have to have, in effect, who will guard the guardians? Like you say in Latin, who will guard the guardians? Do the accreditors have to show that their accreditation means anything? And who do they have to show that to? Is it the federal government? Is it the state governments? Or what?
Well, so there's a whole host of things that the federal government requires accreditors to do, but none of those things really have anything to do with whether students are getting value for their education. The most fundamental question, are you better off for having gone to college? Accreditors don't really look at that. Instead, they're looking at things like, what is the square footage of your classroom? How many books do you have in the library? For some of them, do you have a DEI program? They're not really focused on the questions that are most important to students.
Well, but hold on, Preston. They're going to measure the size of the architecture where you're teaching the class, but not the content of the classes that you actually get, or what learning that stuff will actually do for you. How does that amount to accreditation?
That's a pretty accurate assessment. And I think that the reason that they do all these kinds of things is that accreditors are actually composed of representatives of the very schools they oversee. Schools are going to say, hey, our classrooms are a certain square footage, our libraries have a certain number of books in them. Let's make that the requirement for everybody so that we can keep out our competition, so that if you want to start a new college that doesn't have the right number of books in the library, we're not going to let you do that.
Well, you know what seems crazy to me about that? Preston, Khan Academy came along a long time ago, and we've actually talked to the man behind it. A lot of those kids learn a lot, and their classrooms have no square footage. They're sitting at home. There are no books in the library because all the stuff they're accessing, or most of it, is online. How have they persuaded anybody that kind of accreditation is a smart way to do it?
Yeah, well, Khan Academies, it's a great resource out there. You can go and you can take a lot of courses for free or near free, and learn a lot of valuable skills that way. But I do not believe that they are a school that has accreditation. So if they wanted to go and try and get federal funding, they couldn't do that. So they just have to put their resources out there for students to use. But the students aren't actually going to be able to take that Khan Academy education and say, here's a piece of paper that I got from an accredited college, please give me a job. So that's kind of really the issue that we need to solve here, is that if you do have an innovative new model for higher education that's going to provide education at a fraction of the cost, the accreditors are going to stand in between you and providing that model to the students who really need it.
I'm talking to Preston Cooper. He's a scholar at the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. I want you to be able to go to FREOPP, FREOPP, and take a look at the study he did. And consider this when you sit down with your kids. Preston, maybe instead of starting Double L University, Lars Larson University, maybe you and I should get together and offer an accreditation program. And we'll say it's only $300,000. Preston and I will split the money, and we'll walk around and say, you have a really pretty campus. There's lots of ivy growing up the walls, and the classrooms are attractively painted, and there's a good student union that'll serve you a nice meal. And we can go around and do that, and we can split the $300,000 50-50. What do you say?
I say that sounds like a great idea, but I think what we need to do is actually recognize new accreditors who can come in and compete with the existing accreditors, new accreditors who are actually going to look at, are your students' outcomes good? Can they pay back their loans? Are they getting jobs? Do those jobs, do those degrees have labor market value? New accreditors who are going to be focused on these kind of things rather than the dinosaur incumbent accreditors we have right now, to approve new colleges to compete with the incumbent universities that are going to focus on the outcomes that students really care about.
I think that's a fantastic idea. Make it the underwriters' laboratories of colleges and universities. Preston, I'll encourage people to take a look at the study. The data in it is fascinating. Thanks very much, Preston. You've got the Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. You've heard me talk about GMO crops before. I don't have an inherent problem with GE or GMO crops. I know that there can be abuses of it. I know that there also can be abuses of hybridization of crops, which has been going on for a long, long time. And the guy who knows that best is our friend Dr. Henry Miller, medical doctor, molecular biologist. He's at the American Council on Science and Health. He was founding director of the FDA's Office of Biotechnology. Doc, welcome back.
Great to be with you, Lars. Thank you.
You wrote about genetic engineering recently, and you pointed out this has been going on for a lot longer than people might think.
Absolutely. We've been modifying the genetic complement, the genes of plants in particular, and also microorganisms, since the invention of something called agriculture. That's how we've gotten improved varieties of all sorts of things, wheat and maize in ancient times, maize being converted into modern crops that we call corn, and even microorganisms. There are depictions on Egyptian friezes of their using various yeasts that they've selected carefully and modified through selection to produce alcoholic beverages. So this has been around for a very, very long time. And the important thing is that there's a seamless continuum of techniques that have been used since ancient times through today to create these modifications for yield or taste or other desirable characteristics.
I mean, so anybody who was raising, say, livestock, whether it was back in the day or more recently, would say, I'm going to take a good-sized bull and breed it with the right cows, cows that'll produce other big cows or bulls, and you're going to do that over and over again until you get a herd of a particular kind of cow that does well in the circumstances you're in and produces the meat you're trying to get or the milk, right?
Exactly, and you can even do interspecies breeding. So if you cross a cow with a buffalo, you get something called a beefalo, which years ago I used to buy at the butchers in Washington, but it was never very popular, so I don't think it's around anymore. But that's different species being crossbred, and we do that with plants as well. So a nectarine is a mutant peach, and a tangelo is a pomelo and something else, orange cross. And so it's not mysterious, but activists like to pretend that it is, that it's something we don't have experience with and we're not certain about the safety of, and so on.
But they don't use examples like that. They're not saying, well, you don't want to breed beef that's better beef. And what I reply back to them is, I understand the history of the tomato. If you go back, I don't know if you have to go back 500 years or 1,000 years, but the tomato way back in the day was not a very attractive fruit, and it is a fruit, but it was not very attractive. It is not very tasty. But the stuff I want to put on a sandwich, on a hamburger, is very tasty and very good because of exactly what you're talking about.
Exactly, and as you know, there are different varieties of tomatoes for different purposes. So canning tomatoes, tomatoes used for juice, are different from those that we eat and love in the summertime on a hamburger.
Well, it's interesting, Doc, that people have a different definition of natural because you said, well, those are natural because they're talking about hybridization, where somebody who's growing tomatoes said, I'm going to keep growing this kind of tomato till I get to the variety that I'm looking for. And it might take, I've actually seen some universities where they say, hey, we came up with a new tomato and it took us 20 years to be able to hybridize to this one. They say, well, that's natural. Well, it's not natural because if you're trying to hybridize that tomato, you throw out the ones that didn't quite make it, and you concentrate them toward the one you want. Just like if you were raising greyhound dogs for racing, you throw out the runts, the ones that are short or not very fast, and you keep breeding the ones that are fast together until you get the fastest dog you want or the fastest horse.
Exactly, and over the years, I've had the privilege to go to a couple of plant breeding institutions where they do tastings for you of all sorts of brand new, innovative varieties. So the International Rice Research Institute, as the name suggests, does rice breeding. And that's in the Philippines, Los Baños, Philippines. And there are all sorts of interesting rice with different textures and different flavors. And I once went to a conference at the University of California, Davis, not too far from San Francisco, and there was a tomato tasting sponsored by their tomato breeding group, headed by a very, very wonderful, charismatic, elderly plant scientist named Charlie Ricks. And again, the tomatoes were incredible. Different textures, different characteristics. And I want to pick up one point that you made, that early varieties, early versions of many of the plants and of the fruits and vegetables we eat today were extremely unpalatable and ugly.
Well, would maize be an example of that?
Absolutely. Maize began as a weed-like plant called teosinte that still grows in Mexico, and it looks like the kind of thing that your gardener or you pluck out of your lawn. I mean, there are no visible kernels, and the yields would be horrendous if you tried to eat them or feed them to livestock. But one of the really ugliest is watermelon, which began as a small grapefruit-sized fruit with huge seeds and that wasn't sweet. So you wonder how people knew, how plant breeders, early plant breeders called farmers, knew that they could improve it to the level that we enjoy today.
Well, I mean, were they just watching for the oddball plants that came out? In other words, if you grew a bunch of what were then watermelons and they were the size of a grapefruit, you said, we're going to get the ones that are bigger, we're going to get the ones that have smaller seeds, and we're just going to keep hybridizing those. Is that basically the approach they took?
Exactly, because that's all they had to work with.
So why can't we convince people that as new techniques come up for hybridization, that they aren't willing to adopt them? And why are people so against GMO?
Well, remember Deep Throat's admonition, follow the money. And groups like Greenpeace and U.S. Right to Know and various similar groups raise money by opposing modern technology and promulgating fears about them, about new technologies. So it's true of nuclear, it's true of genetic engineering, it's true of modern, very safe, very effective pesticides, and that's just what these evildoers do.
Well, and it's funny, too, because the first plant patents, weren't they some of the first patents ever in America? And that they were in the late 1700s. So when I hear people complain, well, the GMO companies just want you to buy their seed. Well, people, human beings have been selling seed, saying, you want some really beautiful tulips? You'll get the bulbs from me. You want some really beautiful corn? You'll buy the seed from me. And they did that to make money, which is some have followed the money. But they said, if you want to grow the corn you've always grown, go ahead. But your neighbor's growing the other stuff, and that pays a whole lot better. Dr. Henry Miller is at the American Council on Science and Health. He is the Glenn Swagger Distinguished Fellow there at ACSH. He's also a doctor and a molecular biologist. Dr. Miller, it's a pleasure to have you on the program. You've got the Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to Lars Larson Show. Honestly provocative talk for the United States of America. And Miles Yu joins me now, who's a senior fellow and director of the China Center at the Hudson Institute. Miles, good to have you back.
Thank you for having me, Lars.
Is there a Chinese spy base, or are there plans for one in Cuba, and does it already exist? And is it Joe Biden's fault, or is it Donald Trump's fault?
I think, the answer is yes. There is a Chinese eavesdropping facility down there, but it's everybody's fault because this is not something new. We knew this eavesdropping facility station jointly run by Cubans and Chinese communists as way back as 2001. This is right after the EP-3 plane crash incident when China and Cuba started doing this. So at the time, it was actually widely reported. I don't know why the White House say it started in 2019, because this went through the Bush administration, Obama administration, and Trump, and then Biden. So it's a bipartisan failure to address this problem.
Well, and let me ask you this, is there a way to address the problem? I mean, if they have a listening post in a foreign country that's 80 miles off our shores, is there any effective way that we could stop them from doing that?
Absolutely. We have many, many ways, right? We starting with the diplomatic way. You have to really talk to the Chinese and the Cubans directly. This is basically an act of hostility because the targets are the United States military communications. Now, right. Florida is nobody really knows pay much attention to the fact that Florida is not just the paradise for beachgoers and the retirees from New York City. It's really a place of great military importance because 10 out of the 3 combatant commands of the United States military are in Florida. We're talking about the headquarters of SOUTHCOM,
SOCOM.
Headquarters. several SOCOM and also CENTCOM, all the Middle Eastern warfare is run out of Tampa, right? So CENTCOM. So, and then on top of that, you've got Fourth Fleet based in Mayport, and you've got the Navy's primary pilot training facility, which is in Pensacola, and it's also the primary center of American space program. So China could gain enormous insight into the military communications of Americans' crown jewel and of command and control. So this is really, really dangerous, and I think we should really address this, treat this as a major national security crisis. And I think we can talk to them diplomatically. If not, we can do all sorts of other things, right? We can do some jamming. We can do some kind of countermeasures. So, but I think the most important thing is we have to take this matter seriously.
Well, and have any of the presidential administrations, Republican or Democrat, that you named, have any of them brought it up with China and said, we don't want that facility there, and we demand that you remove it? I mean, even if we know they're not going to just roll over and say, okay, fine, we'll take it out. But have any of the administrations acted on that?
I believe there's some very low-level, operational level mentioning of that, but I don't think there is a senior level negotiation or even demand the dismantling of this facility. It's about time right now, because this also reflects China's global strategy. China's end game is not just to occupy a few islands in the Indo-Pacific. China's end game is to have a global dominance. And the United States is the only country of global military capability. So that's why they were very keen in spying on us, know what we have in our in the war theaters that have nothing to do with China's regional ambition in the Indo-Pacific. So in the Caribbean, in Latin America, and the North Atlantic region. So this is why this is a part of China's global ambition. And we have to deal with from that perspective.
I'm talking to Miles Yu, who's a senior fellow and director of the China Center at the Hudson Institute. Let me take it from the other end. What if we go to Cuba and say, look, Cuba, we've opened up to Cuba a bit. I didn't necessarily like what Obama did, but we've opened up to allow more visits and more aid and a lot more interaction with Cuba, and we could cut that off. Should we go that far? And is that a route to say, Cuba, China may decide they want to do this, and I know you're getting a lot of money from them and a lot of favors from them, but we can also cut you off from our end, and that won't be very good for you. Is that a realistic way to approach it?
Absolutely. I think, this is in violation of a whole bunch of other agreements, open or covert agreements between the United States, Cuba, and several other countries involved. One of the things that we have to understand is China is not just get this kind of permission from Cubans to do this kind of things. China also has been sort of supplying the Cubans with the critical weapons. After the Soviet Union collapsed, China took on the Soviet role and modernizing Cuban's military and shipped them a lot of arms and secretly, sub rosa, and occasionally those shipping vessels were caught in high sea or by some transit ports. So we have a long list of this incidents in the last 20-some years. So I think the United States has a lot of leverage to impose further sanction on Cuba.
Sorry.
Yeah, so we have a lot of leverage. We can do financial sanction, diplomatic sanction, and weapons technology sanction, and we can even do a whole bunch of ways to enhance our sort of our work within the Cuban American diaspora and to put pressure on Havana. So there are many ways to do it. We just need leadership with resolve.
Well, and once they get insinuated sufficiently into Cuba, if Cuba has weapon systems and vehicles and things like that they got from China, they're also dependent on China for replenishment and spare parts, aren't they?
Yes, they are. I mean, the Soviet system was obsolete, and Chinese are supplying some of the parts, and the Chinese are supplying Cubans with some of the more modern telecommunication infrastructure. So China is spending a lot of time in Cuba. And by the way, in addition, China trains its Spanish-speaking, spies and language specialists, not in the European Spanish countries, speaking countries like Spain, or in other Latin American countries, but in Cuba. So you have a large contingent of Chinese trainees in Cuba. So this has been going on for decades.
And they could take the same Belt and Road approach to Cuba that they've taken to other countries like the Solomon Islands. They could say, oh, you're economically distressed. We could help you fix up your port. We could help you fix up water systems and get them dependent the way they have with other countries, correct?
Well, they're doing that, but not in the open because Cuba is still under U.S. sanction. So that's why they don't want to sort of overtly upend their projects in there. So China, on the other hand, has been much more open and transparent in supporting other anti-American regimes in South America, particularly Venezuela. So yeah. China has sold a lot of weapons, particularly high-end fighter jets, missiles, and to Venezuela. First to Chavez regime, now the Maduro. But China also is worried about countries like Venezuela because the Venezuelans are running the country very badly. So it's a money pit for China too. So this is basically, it's a very interesting dynamics there.
It is. That is Miles Yu. Miles, thank you very much. Senior Fellow and Director of the China Center at the Hudson Institute. Coming up in a moment, I'll get to your phone calls and your emails at 866-HEY-LARS. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. We're all watching the economy because I think a lot of us do not wish for bad things to happen, but we understand that there are bad things out there that may just happen no matter what because of the situation in the marketplace. You've got really bad things. We told you a couple of weeks ago that in downtown San Francisco, the absolute destruction of that city is underway. So much so that 2 of the top 4 hotels in the entire city have gone, basically, the owners have handed the keys back to the bank and said, we can't make the payments anymore, and they let them go. And I asked you at the time we told you about that development, we said, hey, how bad does it have to be before a company that owns a very, very expensive, hundreds of millions of dollars wrapped up in a piece of real estate, and you hand the keys back to the bank? Well, it has to be pretty bad. But my next question at the time was, and who's going to walk into that kind of environment in San Francisco and buy that hotel and try to operate it in the same conditions that caused its previous owners to abandon it? And there's some bad possible explanations or possible answers to that question. I thought we'd talk about it with Mark Jaffe, who's a scholar at the Cato Institute. Mark, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Lars.
I think that there are times where you were absolutely right in what you've written, and that is we tend to focus on residential real estate because for the most part, all of us live in homes. And we say, well, what's happening to residential real estate? But commercial real estate is something that we ought to be watching because it's a good indication of where our economy is going, isn't it?
Definitely. And there's really been a lot of negative pressure on commercial real estate prices, especially offices and retail. For a couple of years now, retail actually even going back before the pandemic. So it is an important part of our economy and something, I hope more people become aware of.
Okay, so what happens? I mean, I posed the question when we talked, I think it was 2 weeks ago, about this major investment company that was handing the keys back. I don't know if they literally hand the keys to the hotel back to the bank, but they basically say to the bank, we can't make the mortgage payments on this anymore. We're giving it back to you. And now the bank has to do something with that piece of real estate because in most cases, if a loan becomes non-performing, it actually goes from one side of the books to the other side. It goes from an asset, a performing loan, to a non-asset. It has a doubled effect on the bank's books, on the bank's bottom line. What do they do, and where are we headed, and what do we need to do to head it off?
Right. Well, in the San Francisco case, there's actually another wrinkle. The other side of this transaction is not, in fact, a bank. It's a commercial mortgage-backed security, or CMBS, which is held by a bunch of investors that really don't know a lot about running hotels. So they usually, get experts to represent them. And, in this case, there will be somebody who is agreeable to this group of investors who will take over and manage the property.
But if the conditions were so bad that the previous owners who handed it back say, we can't afford to make the payments, I don't think any company does that, very, very easily. They may say, we don't want to do that. We're giving up what equity we might have should we turn the marketplace around. So who's going to be persuaded to come in and take that over? And am I right to be concerned that the government might just do it and do what they've done in places like New York and say, well, we're going to turn this into a massive piece of housing for either homeless, drug addicts, illegal aliens, or a mix?
I think we have a ways to go before we get there. So let's understand that before 2020, these two hotels, then they have a total of 2,925 rooms, were worth about $1.56 billion, according to the appraiser and the rating agencies. So they took out a $725 million mortgage on it, which seems pretty safe. That's less than a 50% loan to value ratio.
Yep.
Now it looks like the owner has decided that these hotels are worth less than $725 million. So, but let's say they're worth 200 or 300 or 400 million. That means that the investors are going to take a big haircut, but it's still going to make sense for somebody to operate this as a private hotel rather than as public housing or a homeless shelter.
Another piece that you wrote about was vacant urban office space, and you said those things are going for 20 cents on the dollar. Talk about that if you don't mind.
Yeah, well, in San Francisco, we have a commercial vacancy rate of about 30%, and that impacts properties in an uneven way. So some properties are almost completely vacant, and it's really hard to find a landlord who's going to take the risk that they'll buy this, and then in a few years they'll be able to fill up the property. So they really need to, get a big haircut on the previous values of these properties. So we did see one on California Street, which is really one of the major financial streets in San Francisco, go for about 20 to 25 cents on the dollar, where the dollar refers to what it was worth just 3 or 4 years ago.
All right. And when the person takes over that kind of distressed property, are they inclined to pour any great amount of money into it? Because I would imagine that those big buildings cost a lot to maintain, even if you're maintaining them empty. And yet if you're buying it on the cheap, are you going to pour a lot of money into making sure that it stays the kind of quality office space that it was if you don't have any tenants to pay the bill?
Yeah, I think that's a major concern. These properties could definitely filter down because, right, it's not worth a lot to invest in a vacant building. You're not really receiving any revenue from it. You're having to pay property tax and utilities and so forth. So any additional investment, that's going to be really problematic.
Yeah, no doubt. Mark, keep writing it at the Cato Institute. We appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. That's Mark Jaffe. He's one of the writers and a scholar at the Cato Institute, which is a libertarian free market kind of institution, and we're glad to have his insights. Hey, if you're buying that name brand CBD right now, write down this website, genericcbd.com. That's genericcbd.com. Make the switch to generic and save today. Save big time, about 75%. Their products are fantastic. And on a side note, they also sell a muscle and joint cream that's out of this world. We love generic CBD. It retails for about $100. It's on sale right now for $39.95. But you can try it out free of charge. That's right, just pay $2.95 for the shipping. This penetrating cream melts right into your muscles and your joints, your knees, your elbows, and your lower back. You won't believe how fast it goes to work. Plus, it doubles as one of the best moisturizers you've ever tried. Try it out for yourself. You'll love it. And don't worry, it's not a subscription. Get your free sample at genericcbd.com and get that sample on its way right now. See what this amazing CBD cream can do for you. Get your free sample at genericcbd.com. That's genericcbd.com. These products and statements have not been evaluated by the FDA. These products are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease or illness. and you're listening to The Lars Larson Show. So tell Alexa to play The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show, and I'm glad to get to your calls here in just a moment. This is kind of stunning. You've got the U.S. military that's being run into the ground by the Biden administration. They're doing it through woke policies. They're doing it by not doing the things they need to do in terms of funding to make the Pentagon what it needs to be, which is a force to defend the United States of America. And now we find out from Breitbart, the U.S. Army's Protective Services Battalion, otherwise known as the PSB, that is the Defense Department's equivalent to the Secret Service, is now monitoring social media to find out if anybody has posted negative comments about the country's highest-ranking officers. I'll tell you more details of that story in a moment. But if you want to join what we call the best conversation in talk journalism, it's right here at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. Turns out that The Intercept, which is another journalism organization, and Breitbart is citing their work, the PSB's remit includes protecting officers from embarrassment, in addition to more pressing threats like kidnapping and assassination. An Army procurement document from last year obtained by The Intercept shows that the PSB now monitors social media for negative sentiment about officers under its protection as well for direct, indirect, and veiled threats. According to the report, the Army intends not just to monitor platforms on social media for negative sentiment, but also to pinpoint the location of the posters. The Army's new toolkit goes far beyond social media surveillance of the kind offered by private companies like Dataminer, which helps police and military agencies detect perceived threats by scraping social media timelines and chat rooms for various kinds of keywords. Instead, the PSB investigators seemingly combine social media data with a broad variety of public and non-public information, all of it accessible through what's called a universal search selector. Those sources of information include what they call signal-rich discussions from illicit threat actor communities and access to around-the-clock conversations, public research, radio stations, I hope it's not ours, news outlets, personal records, hacked information, webcams, and get this, cell phone location data can be used for good or bad. We've talked about it before. The document mentions the use of what's called geofence data as well, which is a practice where an investigator draws a shape on a digital map to focus their surveillance in a particular area. While app-based smartphone tracking is a potent surveillance technique, it remains unclear how exactly the data might actually be used to unmask threats on social media. So the Pentagon is watching not just what our enemies or our adversaries overseas are doing, they're watching what's going on inside the United States of America. As an American citizen who's happy to pay his taxes to support the U.S. military, I'm not very happy about that. Our Twitter poll today, and you can find the question at Lars Larson Show and at larslarson.com. Should America endorse the independence of Taiwan or China's ownership of that country? I would go for independence. You can vote in the Twitter poll at Lars Larson Show and consider what happened when America's Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, who works for Joe Biden, he goes to China to visit with Xi Jinping. Now, the last time he planned to go to China, the trip was canceled. And why? Because China was in the middle of flying spy balloons over our country that Joe Biden tried to ignore and finally shot down, but only after those spy balloons had overflown the entire country, including military bases, and sent data back in real time to Beijing. And then we finally shot it down. So Anthony Blinken goes to Beijing. He talks to Xi Jinping. Does he demand to know why China is imprisoning 3 million slaves in its country, slaves who are often used to make products that are then sold in the United States? We have a law against that, but apparently we don't enforce it. Why is China allowing the manufacture of fentanyl, which is then shipped out of China, goes through Mexico, comes into the United States, and kills more than 100,000 people every year? Why is it that Chinese ships and airplanes have had close calls with our ships and our airplanes? And what about Taiwan? Taiwan is its own country. Taiwan is a self-governing country that is a freedom-loving country. Mainland China is a communist dictatorship. And who does the United States support? Well, Anthony Blinken makes it a point to say we do not support Taiwan independence. Now, Joe Biden has previously said that he believes if there is an attack that the United States would defend Taiwan. So who's actually calling the shots in Joe Biden's White House? Is it Joe Biden or is it the Chinese communists who are actually pulling his strings? Today's Twitter poll can be found at Lars Larson Show and at larslarson.com. Brought to you by AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens. AMAC has the conservative values I believe in. I joined the group. You should too. Just go to amac.us or call 888-262-2006. AMAC is better. Better for you and better for America. Last Friday, I asked you this Twitter poll question: would you get the COVID booster shot at the recommendation of the FDA? Now, I've told you, just because I always disclose if I have a dog in the fight, I decided the jab, the mRNA shot, was not worth it for me. My wife made the same decision. We haven't done any of the boosters, and we've been perfectly all right. So now the FDA is pushing people to go get the COVID boosters. Apparently, they want to make sure that all those pharmaceutical companies don't get stuck with a bunch of expiring vaccines from which they plan to make millions of dollars. 95% of you joined me in a no vote and said, no, I'm not going to get the COVID booster shot just because the FDA says I should. And by the way, I saw a note from one of my emailers today who said, Lars, what happened to all those really dangerous variants on SARS-CoV-2? Remember about a year ago, they were telling us, the medical authorities were telling us, why there are all these dangerous variants that are coming, and we're going to be in big trouble in a year or whenever. Where have all those variants gone? They seem to have gone away, although maybe the Biden administration has just put them in storage until we get close to another election, because after all, the pandemic works out very well for the folks in the Biden administration. It has before, and it will again. Today's Twitter poll is brought to you by AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens. AMAC has the conservative values I believe in. I join. You should too. Just go to amac.us or call 888-262-2006. AMAC is better. Better for you and better for America. I want to point something out to you. Today marks 1 month since Chicago's brand new mayor, Brandon Johnson, entered office. He commemorated the milestone on Twitter with a thread detailing what he's focused on so far. Notably, there was only one mention of public safety, and it wasn't even a reference to a specific policy. That's significant because new data shows that Mayor Brandon Johnson of Chicago has presided over a 38% increase, a spike in crime in his first month compared to the same period of last year. And that's saying something. Back in a moment. Glad to get your calls. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'll get back to your phone calls and emails in just a bit. But I've got to talk to a friend about something that is an amazing accomplishment. I've never written a book, but James Rosen is a smart guy, and he writes books. And he's also a correspondent at Newsmax, and you want to check out his work there as the chief White House correspondent. But I consider his greatest work, his knowledge of one of my favorite Supreme Court justices now passed. And I have to tell you, James, as you come on the show to talk about this great new book that you've come out with, the first of 2 volumes, that I remember the day my wife and I were in the car. I believe it was a Saturday. It could have been a Sunday, but usually not a weekday. It was raining. It was kind of miserable outside. We were going from point A to point B, just running errands. And we heard the news on the radio that the great Antonin Scalia had passed away. And both of us at the same time said, oh, no, because he was such an important institution on that group of 9 people who make some of the most consequential decisions in American history. So, James Rosen, welcome to the program. I want you to tell my audience about Scalia, Rise to Greatness, 1936 and 1986. And, of course, you have a second volume coming to complete the great justice's life.
Lars, first of all, thanks for having me back. It's always great to be with you. You've been very kind to me over the years. This book, Scalia, Rise to Greatness, tells the story of Antonin Scalia's first 50 years. It ends with him sitting on the Supreme Court, taking his seat. And so I hope I'll be back with you in 2.5 years' time to discuss the second volume, which will cover
Guaranteed.
the Supreme Court years. But what I found, Lars, was that the two existing biographies of Antonin Scalia, both of which were published in his lifetime, one of which he cooperated with, the other not at all, both arrived more or less in the same place, which was fairly open in their contempt for Justice Scalia's jurisprudence, his legacy, his conduct. And so this is the first biography of Antonin Scalia published since his death. It is the first to make use of a vast wealth of documentary and personal sources that were either overlooked by or unavailable to the previous biographers. And it is the most accurate and perhaps the first accurate biography of Antonin Scalia because it is the first admiring biography of Antonin Scalia. This book starts from the point of view that Scalia was, as I think is becoming increasingly clear as more time goes on, the most influential justice perhaps of the last 100 years. But beyond that, he was one of the most influential Americans of the last 100 years. And a devout Catholic, a father of 9 with his incredible wife, Maureen Scalia, and an example in so many ways as a human being and a public servant in a way that's never been attempted or captured, certainly by his previous biographers. So there's so much that's new material for us to talk about, but I think I'll leave it there and let you, propose different questions.
I'm talking to Newsmax White House chief correspondent James Rosen about his book, Scalia, Rise to Greatness, 1936 to 86. And I know that reporters tend not to brag on these kinds of connections, and it's probably right that they don't. But I want to tell you, the author of this new book about Scalia knew the man. And when you say, I knew the man, there are lots of people, James, that you and I have interviewed that we really couldn't claim to know, couldn't claim, as you've written, to have broken bread with him, to have drank a glass of wine, to have been a passenger in the justice's, as you put it, famously speedy BMW. You knew the man. And that's, among biographers, that's probably not all that common.
Well, it's certainly an advantage for anyone trying to draw a book-length portrait of someone to have interacted with them. And I am privileged to say that I was able to, when I first came to Washington, to become a Washington correspondent for Fox News at the time, back in 1999 at the age of 30, one of the first things I did was write to Justice Scalia to request an interview. And this commenced between us a rather amusing and unusual correspondence that went over the course of about 2 years, which will be excerpted in Volume 2, but also a pair of lunches that we had, one-on-one, at his favorite spot, the AV Ristorante Italiano, now long defunct, but that was the spot he'd been going to since his Georgetown days in the 50s. And, it was remarkable because we did have a bottle of wine together on each of those occasions. He did, on one occasion, insist that I eat off of his plate, and I said, Mr. Justice, I couldn't. He's like, come on. So there I was shoveling vegetables off of Justice Scalia's plate, and he gave me rides back to my office, and they were as you described. And I've subsequently been able to confirm with a number of classmates from the 50s on to clerks in the 21st century who felt similarly endangered as a passenger in the justice's car. So it is correct that having those sort of intimate, up-close details about a person, even if they only amounted to 2 lunches, and I can't say that I know him in the sense that his true friends know him, it is invaluable for a biographer, and I like to think that it's part of what enabled me to capture him in a way where those closest to him on the back jacket can be seen saying that here for the first time, as in no previous biography, is the man I actually knew.
Well, I'm sure the man Justice Antonin Scalia got lots and lots of requests for interviews, for interaction, and that sort of thing. Would you care to characterize the nature of this? Was this something he did all the time, take journalists to lunch or offer to let them eat off his plate?
So the contents of the lunch of our discussion was off the record and will remain that way.
Sure.
And he was in the habit of doing it from time to time. And partly this is what accounted for the 2-year span over which our lunches occurred, because I tried to keep up the relationship and write to him and say, hey, let me buy lunch this time and that sort of thing. And there really wasn't much response as opposed to the earlier exchanges of humorous letters. And in the interim, a reporter named Hannah Rosen, R-O-S-I-N, as opposed to the way I spell my name, who was the religion correspondent for the Washington Post at the time. This would be in the spring of 2001. Published in GQ magazine with Ben Affleck on the cover, an article about going to lunch with Antonin Scalia at the AV Ristorante. Its contents off the record, but for the purposes of the article, let's just say she danced with Muhammad Ali-like finesse back and forth across the line of what you would publish if it truly was off the record.
Sure.
And of course, it stands in the minds of the Scalia family as an infamous moment in the journalism covering of their dad, where this was violated to their sensibilities in such blatant fashion in GQ magazine. And having seen that, I thought to myself, well, he's probably going to be reluctant to get together at all now. I wrote him again, and this time he wrote me again on stationery, Lars. And as I say, these letters will be in Volume 2. This book, Scalia Rise to Greatness, 1936 to 1986, really tells the first 50 years of Antonin Scalia's life, the moment he sits down to be a Supreme Court justice. But he wrote to me, he said, "You'll forgive me." This was after this GQ article. "You'll forgive me if my taste for lunches with members of the press has gone sour." And it was very terse like that. And I wrote back, and I said, "Thank you for yours of such and such date. However, it seems to me that you are guilty of engaging in a knowingly injudicious application of sanction to offender and non-offender alike." And he wrote back again on stationery and said, in essence, "Mr. Rosen, you really know how to hurt a fellow." And he added, in quotes, "knowingly injudicious application of sanction to offender and non-offender alike," unquote, is very good.
I'm talking to James Rosen. He is the White House chief correspondent for Newsmax and also the author most recently of the first of 2 volumes, Scalia, Rise to Greatness, 1936 to 1986. Before we leave the subject of Off the Record, I want you, I've given my audience my explanation of why Off the Record sounds suspicious to people not in the trade, perhaps, that you're just getting together and being buddy-buddy with folks. But there's an important nature to off-the-record conversations between a reporter and the subject of a story, isn't there?
So, of course, as you survey practicing journalists and historians and biographers, you'll get different opinions of what off-the-record actually means, and whether it should be observed post the death of someone who's a public figure who has spoken off the record. And there are differing opinions about all of this. The off-the-record conversations that I have with Justice Scalia will assuredly remain that way. But you are correct that conversing off the record between those who write about events for a living and those who live the events does serve an important function.
I'm talking to James Rosen. His book, the first of 2 volumes, is Scalia Rise to Greatness, 1936 to 1986. He is the White House chief correspondent for Newsmax, and we'll be back in just a moment to talk more with James Rosen. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and it's my pleasure to have with me James Rosen, White House chief correspondent for Newsmax, of course, but also the author of the first of 2 volumes, Scalia Rise to Greatness, 1936 to 1986. And James, I have to say, I do consider Clarence Thomas to be my current favorite justice on the court. But before Justice Thomas, he would have come second to Antonin Scalia, I think because of his honesty. But I want you to speak to something else. Both of us are used to these days being told about firsts, and firsts have become kind of ridiculous. This is the first lesbian, female, transgender, disabled person to hold this post. And the titles get longer and longer. But Justice Scalia was a first Italian on the court. Did that get a lot of attention, and was it uniformly positive or negative?
It did get a lot of attention when then Judge Scalia was nominated by President Reagan in 1986 to be elevated to the Supreme Court. It was prominently featured in just about everything written about Antonin Scalia, that he would be the first Italian-American justice on the Supreme Court. In my book, Scalia Rise to Greatness, we published for the first time some of the letters that were sent to President Reagan with such fervent gratitude from members of the Italian-American community at the time, where they say to President Reagan, "We made our pleas to Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and so on. They all heard," they wrote to President Reagan, "only you listened." When Scalia was nominated to and confirmed to the Supreme Court, the Italian-American community experienced a kind of explosion of joy that was unlike anything since perhaps 1952 when Rocky Marciano had captured the heavyweight championship of the world. But the Scalia achievement meant even more to Italians because it was untainted by the violence of the ring, and by any association with corruption, which from time to time governed boxing. Here, in becoming a Supreme Court justice and donning the robes, Scalia's achievement was wholly intellectual, untainted, and in fact carried a kind of holy air to it, as the Supreme Court, until fairly recently, always did, a kind of mystique and enshrouded in the highest regard. And so for the Italian-American community, Scalia's nomination and confirmation marked one in a series of achievements for prominent Italian-Americans from John Sirica onward, but really the most meaningful of them.
Let's talk about his time on the court. Why was he so notable? I could tell you my reasons, but I've read a bunch of his decisions, and I'm not a lawyer, but I was always impressed with his reasoning and with his adherence to the Constitution, which sounds kind of, well, justices, that's all they're supposed to do is decide based on the Constitution and the law. And yet some of the justices don't do it that way. Scalia stuck to the document, didn't he?
Precisely so, Lars. Scalia is so important. And should be considered among the most influential Americans of the last 100 years, precisely because of what you've raised. This is a kind of revolution that Antonin Scalia personally launched and helped bring to fruition in American law. And because America's laws control every aspect of our lives day to day, that's why Scalia's influence is so profound and broad. But specifically, his revolution was that before Scalia joined the federal bench, judges in America adhere to what is primarily a liberal point of view about the law, which is that the Constitution is a living document, that there's a living Constitution. This idea that the Constitution and our interpretations of its meaning should expand, because there were a lot of things the Founding Fathers could never have envisioned, such as nuclear weapons or the Internet. And therefore, our interpretations of what the Constitution and other statutes passed since then, what they mean should be elastic and should expand. And to accomplish that, these judges therefore go beyond the text of the law to look at what the legislative intent was. And that's reflected in debates that were held on the House and Senate floors or in committee reports that would be published along the way as the law snaked its way through the process. Scalia stood athwart all of this. Scalia championed a philosophy known as originalism, that judges doing their central business, which is to tell us what the laws mean, right? What the Constitution means, how to interpret the Constitution or given laws. Scalia said we should adhere to the original meaning of the Constitution or that statute according to the meaning it had at the time that it was enacted and signed into law. We should not graft our latter-day wishes for what it meant onto the existing text of a law. And how best to discern original meaning of a law, what it was widely understood to mean at the time, how best to determine that? And here Scalia introduced the chief tool for his originalism, which is textualism. Scalia's belief was the legislative intent was the actual text that they voted on, yes or no, and that a president signed into law. We don't have to look any further than that, or we should at least start with that. What was the text? And so after Scalia, it is much more common now, and in fact it's almost unheard of for lawyers, as they used to do when arguing before judges and justices on the Supreme Court, to invoke or begin with legislative history and what was said on the Senate floor. The instinct for all lawyers now is to immediately begin with the text of the law. Scalia effected this revolution not because he was on the winning side of so many Supreme Court cases, but even because he was often writing in dissent and solo dissent, but through the force of his ideas, the liveliness of his intellect and his wit and his determination that his opinions should be easily readable as they were for you and me, Lars, by people who are not lawyers. Through all of this, he eventually, but by the time Scalia died, no less a figure than Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan, an appointee of Barack Obama, proclaimed that, in effect, thanks to Scalia's influence, quote, we are all originalists now. Remember that this affects every area of American life.
Well, and one of the most notable, 13 years before he came to the court and reversed after his passing, would have been the Roe v. Wade case in 73, and then its overturn in Dobbs. He wasn't there for 73 for Roe. He wasn't there for Dobbs. But what would his take have been on the idea that there is no mention of abortion in the Constitution or anything like it, but the justices in Roe decided, well, we read between the lines and find a right to abortion there, a right that was then, or a decision that was overturned in the Dobbs case within our lifetimes just last year. What would he have made of it, and what did he make of that decision?
if you pick up this book, which just came out this week, Scalia, Rise to Greatness, among the hidden treasures you will find is Antonin Scalia's first ever public reference to abortion as a subject matter, which was on an AEI, American Enterprise Institute, televised debate in 1978 when he was a professor at the University of Chicago Law School. And you trace, as you go through the pages of Scalia, Rise to Greatness, you will see how he eventually carried forth these same views into his work as a jurist. To the question of what he would have said about Dobbs, we can say two things safely. One is that Dobbs, as constructed, adhered to some of the same jurisprudential critiques of Roe that Scalia himself had been articulating for decades. I also just laid out for our listeners the nature of Scalia's particular genius and revolution, which was for originalism and standing against the notion that we should imbue earlier existing texts or bodies of work with latter-day opinions or policy preferences. And so you'll have to understand if I'm leery of attributing to Antonin Scalia, who passed from the scene some 7 years ago, any particular views about any particular decision or members of the court or what have you.
It has been a pleasure speaking with James Rosen, who is the Newsmax chief White House correspondent and the author, most recently, of the first of two books. The first one is called Scalia, Rise to Greatness. It covers 50 years, 1936 to 1986, when Justice Scalia took the bench. The second book, of course, will finish Justice Scalia's life. We'll look forward to talking to James when that is out. And in the meantime, we'll be glad to take your phone calls at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. As always, naysayers go to the head of the line. You can send emails to talk@LarsLarson.com. Vote in our Twitter poll at Lars Larson Show, and you can always tell Alexa to play the Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. Well, Joe Biden's favorite son, the other one died of cancer in battle. If you listen to Joe Biden long enough, he'll tell that lie again. Hunter is set to plead guilty to tax crimes and also a weapons crime. Is that going to affect Joe Biden's run for re-election to president? I don't think he was elected the first time, but that's a debate for another day. Peter Roth joins me now, who's a Newsweek contributing editor and a great friend of the program. How are you doing, Peter?
I'm just fine. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm glad to see that finally Hunter Biden is prosecuted for something. He'll have to plead guilty to something, and he will be a convict. I'm not happy about the fact that everybody, including the mainstream media, seems to diminish this. In fact, I heard CBS News last night saying that he was going to plead guilty to tax and weapons violations. Well, to my mind, a violation is a parking ticket or a speeding ticket. A crime is what Hunter Biden committed. But maybe that's a small matter compared to what it's going to do to Joe Biden's prospects for next year.
I think, frankly, what it does is it makes the American public more interested in what Hunter Biden was doing rather than less interested. I think that the president's political team, because remember, this happened on the same day that he settled all matters with the woman with whom he had a child, whom Joe Biden refuses to meet with, acknowledge, or in any way support.
Yep.
His 4-year-old granddaughter, Navy. They settled that. They settled the tax issue. They settled the gun felony, all on one day. And I think what they're trying to do is push the reset button and say, okay, all the Hunter problems are resolved. And there's an ongoing debate here in our nation's capital about whether or not that includes the allegations that he took a $5 million bribe from Burisma and got chunks of $500 million for other members of the Biden family, as well as a whistleblower has credibly claimed. If that investigation stops too.
And told the FBI 3 years ago. And Peter, when I saw that, about the form, I think it's the 1023 form. And my first question was, what's the date on it? Well, it's 3 years ago, to 2020. And that's before the 2020 election, a long time before. I think it was May of 2023. And I wanted to know, so the FBI sat on it for 3 years. They could have, when they were finally told you will bring this to Congress, They could have walked in and said, "You're right, Congressman. We got that tip. We ran it to ground, and there is nothing to it." Or they could have said, "We didn't run it to ground. There appears to be something to it, possibly, and Joe Biden's alleged bribery, the bribery of Joe Biden is still under investigation." Well, they didn't want to say either one of those, so they haven't said anything. So it's possible for the FBI to get one of its solid tipsters to tell them information of a major league crime, a $5 million bribe of an American vice president, and for them to just sit on it for 3 years and determine nothing about it?
Well, I think it is possible if you're spending all your time investigating the Steele dossier, which, as we now know, was a product of the Hillary Clinton political operation, aided and abetted by the Obama White House. But again, this is why they settled the Arkansas case with the baby mama, too, because that was an issue of how much Hunter was going to pay in child support, which would have required him to reveal to the judge and put into the record of that case information about his finances that he and his father don't want people to know.
Yep.
I think this turns the heat up on Hunter Biden rather than tamping it all down. And I think it's going to be a problem for the president. I think the people are smarter than they give them credit for being, and they want to know the answers. And I think it makes them look more guilty.
I think you're right. And the other thing, while it seems like it's not necessarily it's not at all a legal issue, but do you remember the reaction when it turned out that Jesse Jackson had a love child and that Jesse Jackson had nothing to do with the kid? Now, maybe people's values have changed since then, but I keep reminding my audience in various commentaries I've done, what do you make of a granddad who says, "I have a new grandchild," and refuses to even admit the existence of the grandchild or acknowledge it in any way? Well, if your friend did that, you might think, well, my friend's kind of a lousy person. You might even say, I won't have anything to do with you, depending on how strongly you feel about it. You have a grandchild and you won't admit to its existence. You don't have any plans to visit the grandchild, to to talk to the grandchild, to check on the welfare of the grandchild. I mean, for me as a granddad, that's absolutely unconscionable. And you say, well, the child was born under, less than perfect circumstances. You know what, reader? There are a whole bunch of grandkids out there who are born under less than perfect circumstances, and grandparents and parents really should say, I will do right by that child. That is one of the obligations of a parent. Joe won't do it.
I have a grandchild born just the end of last month, my first grandchild, and she's perfect in every way.
Absolutely.
And I would do anything for her. And how the President of the United States can stand up and lecture me and other fathers on what our obligations are, as he did in his Father's Day proclamation and in the speeches he gives about the need to care for women and children, and how the Republicans are trying to starve the poor and hurt children with their policies on climate and health care. For him to not even acknowledge his grandchild, I mean, never mind that you and I may be putting more towards her support through our tax dollars than he may be paying out of his own pocket for his own blood. But for him to not even acknowledge this poor girl, it's sickening.
It really is. It's sickening. It takes us back to, a presidential candidate who ran, who had a child, didn't want to acknowledge it. I mean, all of those things. That goes beyond politics. It goes beyond criminal law. It's not a crime to not acknowledge your kid, but it's so terribly wrong that I can't imagine anybody wanting to vote for somebody like that. That is Peter Roth, contributing editor at Newsweek. Peter, thank you very much. I appreciate the time. Hey, are you a small business owner who could use a few $100,000? Employee retention tax credits, they're an incredible opportunity for you. Call the experts at Get My Funds. They've been around since the beginning of the pandemic. They've already helped out 1,500 small business owners, and they got about $300 million. And they know what they're doing at Get My Funds. They have a team of CPAs who specialize in filing for those tax credits, and they're with you every step of the way, even if there's an audit. if you retained 5 or more W-2 employees during COVID. And even if you already got the Paycheck Protection Plan money, you need to call Get My Funds now at 800-535-2950. It's not a grant, it's not a loan, it's a tax refund. And there are no upfront fees to find out if you qualify. Go with a team you can trust. Get My Funds at 800-535-2950 or getmyfunds.com. That's getmyfunds.com. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com and tell Alexa to play The Lars Larson Show.
You believe the Cyclops 2 is pretty much invulnerable.
By the time we're done testing it, I believe it's pretty much invulnerable.
And that's pretty much what they said about the Titanic.
That's right. And I will go on all the first dives, put my money where my mouth is.
Where my mouth is, that's Stockton Rush. And sadly, he is the CEO of OceanGate that owns that lost submarine. And he is among those feared lost when the submarine simply disappeared. Now, the search goes on, and it is still search and rescue. That's what they call it when they still think they might be able to find people alive on board that submarine. But at some point, they may call it recovery if they do not find the sub by the time that oxygen is due to run out sometime tomorrow morning. But everybody in the world, it seems, is talking about the missing sub full of billionaires. So I want to pitch in my 2 cents. But first, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. Glad to have you on board. And if you want to join the best conversation in talk journalism, it's here every single weekday at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. If you're a naysayer, we'll put you right to the head of the line. So if you disagree with me, we're glad to put you first. If you'd like to vote in our Twitter poll, you can find that at Lars Larson Show and on my website at larslarson.com if you prefer not to go to Twitter. Now, I hope that all the people on board that sub, 3 billionaires who are on board that sub, I hope that they're all found alive, even though the facts on the ground or on the ocean at this point seem to suggest that that is not going to be the case. I also wish that the media and the public would pay more attention, say, for example, to the 500 people who appear to have just died off Libya when a ship full of actual, genuine war refugees, not the kind of fake refugees that have been turning up at the southern U.S. border. Those aren't refugees. Those are people who want a better job, and oftentimes they lie their way into the United States. But off Libya, an entire ship with 750 people on board went down. 500 are believed to have been lost, but most of the media, they're not paying attention to that one. Maybe it's because the collective net worth of those 500 people who may have died when that ship went down couldn't even pay the water bill at one of Bill Gates' houses, so they're largely ignored. That's wrong, but that's the way this world seems to be behaving these days. I think it's kind of shameful. I'm also happy that there are still adventurers out there who risk their lives and their fortunes to explore new places. I mean, think about it. If Chris Columbus had not talked Queen Isabella out of all that cash to go on an adventure, things might have worked out very differently here in North America. But this may provide an even better lesson about wokeness and political correctness. And I'm going to quote Stockton Rush, the guy who is believed to be missing on board the Titan. That's the name of the submarine that's missing. He is the CEO of OceanGate, the company that runs those submarine trips. Well, he said a few things about who he was going to hire and who he was not going to hire when he built his company. He said that if you take a look around, there are a number of companies on planet Earth that actually run submarines for hire, where you can go in, plop down the right amount of money. In the case of OceanGate, it was about $250,000 per passenger to take that ride down to the Titanic. That's the guy who you heard in the soundbite at the beginning of this segment saying that the Titan, the submarine that's lost right now, was invulnerable. Now, I don't know about you, but I understand that when people first got in airplanes, they didn't view themselves as invulnerable. They knew that there were gigantic risks. When men and women first began to venture out onto the ocean on sailboats, they knew that there were risks. Approaching that kind of thing with the attitude that my machine is invulnerable. But then get this. This guy, Stockton Rush, had told a reporter, he said, I'm not hiring those 50-year-old white guys to work for my company because they're not inspirational. And he pointed out that he knew the other people in the submarine business were hiring former Navy veterans of being submariners because they traveled on submarines. And he said, I'm not hiring those guys. And he also had kind of a flip attitude about safety. He actually fired one of their directors because the director said, I want better safety and better safety testing and more rigorous safety testing. He also refused to put that submarine through any kind of independent testing to prove that it was, as he said, invulnerable. He said that the machines that he was designing were invulnerable, and he said he was willing to put his money where his mouth was. Well, he did. He was riding on board that sub. He is one of those believed to be on board the sub for which the Coast Guard and the U.S. government are making a major search to try to find it before the oxygen runs out. He also said in an interview that anybody can drive a sub because they actually had, as the operating controls of that sub, a $30 video game controller. He said anybody can drive the sub. We can teach somebody how to drive the sub, but we're not hiring 50-year-old white guys with a lot of experience. We're going to hire young people because they're going to be inspirational. That appears to have been the approach that he took. Now, let me go to Alma. Alma, one of my favorite naysayers of all time, Alma from Bothell, Washington. How are you?
I'm fine, and how are you, Lars?
I'm doing very well.
I get inspiration from talking to you. Now,
I'm glad to hear that.
Listen to this. Donald Trump Jr. received email June the 16th telling him that Russia connected family was finding dirt on Hillary Clinton. They didn't do anything to him, and he laughed about it. That was against the law. Nobody's talking about that, right?
What was against the law? Because Donald Trump was falsely framed in the Russia hoax. If you didn't have confirmation before, Alma, you found it in the Durham report. You found it in the Mueller investigation, which went almost 2 years and cost Americans more than $30 million. And they confirmed there was no Russia collusion. It was all a hoax put together by Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and the FBI.
Hillary Clinton was accused for how long? Of doing emails, and nothing was found. You guys stayed on her for, 5 years? Nothing on this man's son for 5 years. He
Alma,
just did it, he did wrong. Yes, I'm listening.
Since you brought up the emails, she admitted that she destroyed 30,000 federal documents. Are you okay with that?
Well, I'm not okay, but I'm not going to harp on it for the next 5 years. But, Lord, listen, let's move on about our country business. There's so much to do in the country rather than keep digging up old stuff.
Okay, let's do some new stuff, Alma. Should Joe Biden be impeached for high crimes and misdemeanor?
No, he hasn't done anything.
Why not?
Trump should be impeached, but we got proof.
Trump got impeached and acquitted twice, Alma. Trump got impeached twice. One of the impeachments was because he had a phone call with Ukraine, and he said, you've got corruption going on there that involves people from the U.S. Will you investigate it? He got impeached for that. We now find out that Joe Biden, the big guy, got a $5 million bribe from Ukraine, and the FBI has been sitting on that information for 3 years. Doesn't that sound like a high crime or misdemeanor to take a bribe as vice president?
That's not true either. We don't have so much truth on that. But Trump did espionage, and you guys trying to act like he did do espionage.
He did espionage? Because he took home
That's
presidential papers, he was engaged in espionage. Alma, you are a peach. I love you. You are my favorite naysayer of all time, bar none. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm always glad to get to your calls, and I'll get to those in just a moment at 866-HEY-LARS. We've had some fun naysayers so far today, and we invite more. If you're a naysayer, we put you right to the head of the line at 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com, and join me in welcoming Reverend James Harden, who is the CEO of Compass Care Pregnancy Services. So he's not only a man of the cloth, he's a man who's trying to save lives out there as well. Reverend Harden, welcome back.
Lars, thanks for having me back. It's an honor.
Well, it's great to have you on the program because if people don't know what Compass Care is, it fits within the category of pregnancy resource centers, meaning there is more than one way to accommodate a pregnancy, even if the young lady doesn't believe she has the resources to raise that child. And pregnancy resource centers like Compass Care offer that up. And you and I have talked about the physical attacks, the fire bombings, and all that. I want to talk about something happier. And just for a change today, if you don't mind, Reverend, about the anniversary of the Dobbs decision that effectively overturned the long wrong notion that the Constitution somehow protects the right of abortion, as the liberals like to call it.
Yeah, this is a great anniversary. June 24th is the one-year anniversary of the reversal of a government-fabricated right, competing with one of the inalienable ones. Government fabricated a right to abortion, which of course doesn't exist in the Constitution. But what the government, with our Declaration of Independence, recognizes is that we are endowed by our Creator, capital C, with certain inalienable rights. The right to life being the one that presupposes all others. And so, like the Dobbs decision said, when Roe versus Wade was decided in 1973, immediately it was on a collision course with the Constitution, because they're trying to change the definition of rights from God-given to government-given. It's not the Declaration of Dependence, it's the Declaration of Independence.
No, and you're absolutely right about that. And it's sad, Reverend, that so many people have forgotten that. In fact, there's a soundbite that we run on the show on a regular basis, and its author and the man speaking is John F. Kennedy. And what he said, and it's the line that comes right after the line everybody remembers from the Kennedy inaugural, that let the word go forth from this time and place. Everybody knows that one. But one of the next lines he said, either one or two sentences later, was the founders of a country founded on the then radical notion that the rights of man come from God and not from the government. Now, of course, he'd be kicked out of the Democrat Party these days for saying any such thing. I think he would. I think they'd ride him out of town on a rail, Reverend, if somebody said, what do you mean rights come from God? We don't believe in God, and government gives you everything you want, right?
Right, and that's exactly. There's been a secularist crusade to de-Christianize and take God out of the formula for what it means to be a civilized order. Well, you can't do that and expect a civilized order to thrive, because the basis of human dignity is the fact that we're made just a little lower than God, not just a little higher than the animals. So John F. Kennedy was correct, and the pro-abortion politicians in charge of the Democrat Party right now, not only want to change the definition of liberty, but they're using abortion to do just that, to replace the rule of law with the rule of man and their rules.
Now, what do we do about? Let me talk. Saturday is the anniversary of the overturning, and I know the Democrats are planning something to celebrate. I guess, or to mark this, and they're not celebrating at this point because they think it's terrible that all of a sudden tens of thousands of babies are not dead, and that's what they're celebrating this Saturday, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a sickness that abortion represents. I mean, the sickness of society, a sickness of soul, where society is no longer understands its purpose, and I think that. There's a concern, specifically on Saturday, but our organizations are concerned about it. We've got heavy checks from the police going around. The concern is additional violence. There was the Department of Homeland Security issued a bulletin from the National Terrorism Advisory System late in May, warning of the increased likelihood of violence because of this decision and another decision too. The U.S. Fifth Circuit Court is expected to rule on a case that could upend the FDA's illegal approval, by the way, of the chemical abortion drug mifepristone. So dangerous, by the way, it's dubbed the chemical coat hanger, despite being touted by the abortion industry and Joe Biden as safer than Tylenol. So overruling the FDA's approval could cut abortion in half instantly, since over 50% of all abortions in the U.S. are done chemically. And the violence that was sparked with this unprecedented illegal breach of Supreme Court security by the leak of the Dobbs case back last May, it was essentially buttressed by the recruitment of kind of Antifa, pro-abortion Antifa supporters and their violent acts with this court case that's now in the Fifth Circuit. We were attacked a second time in Buffalo on the evening of the oral arguments for this particular case. And now the Fifth Circuit is expected to rule any day now. And of course, what the Terrorism Advisory Bulletin says is this: factors, I'm reading now, factors that could mobilize individuals to commit violence include judicial decisions pertaining to socio-political issues. Yep. Likely targets of potential violence include faith-based institutions. Well, that's pregnancy centers. That's pro-life institutions. That's us. And of course, the Department of Homeland Security refuses to call it domestic terror, what we've been experiencing, and they refuse to call it what it is, pro-abortion terrorists attacking pro-life Christians.
And why? Do you have any idea why? Is it just politics that says the FBI won't call it domestic terrorism? Because Reverend, in my experience, the old FBI, at least 20 years ago, didn't hesitate. In fact, I remember before 9/11, I was talking to an FBI SAC, special agent in charge of one state, and I said, what's the biggest threat? And this was before 9/11. What's the biggest threat from terrorism here in America? And he said environmentalist groups, environmental wackos. And he didn't call them wackos. I called them wackos. But that probably was at the time. But today, in the aftermath of the Dobbs decision, which I think was right, why would they hesitate to call it domestic terrorism?
Well, I think one of the reasons is that these environmentalists are in league with the transgender movement as well as the pro-abortion movement. What we're finding is our private investigators are finding that they're all the same. Many of them are the same people, and they call themselves anti-fascist, Antifa. And so, this is not necessarily new. It's just that our concern is that Antifa sympathies have infiltrated in the upper echelons of government as well as law enforcement. So, for example, the Department of Justice is responsible for prosecuting any violence against pro-life entities. But there have been over 300 attacks on pro-life entities and no convictions. Even in our case, so with a firebombing, no arrests, no convictions, nothing. The FBI seems to be silent. Well, who's in charge of the Civil Rights Division at the DOJ responsible for prosecuting these cases? It's Kristen Clark. Who's Kristen Clark? She's a known BLM Antifa supporter. She's a known supporter of local defunding of police, and she is known to be vehemently opposed to pro-life pregnancy centers. It's a conflict of interest, and Merrick Garland is running cover for her.
Unbelievable. Reverend Hardin, keep up the good work at Compass Care Pregnancy Services. You do an important job for America, and you save lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Lars.
It is a pleasure to have you on. That's Reverend James Hardin, the CEO of Compass Care Pregnancy Services. By the way, if you're buying that name brand CBD right now, write down this website, genericCBD.com. That's genericCBD.com. Make the switch to generic and save today. Big time, up to 75%. Their products, fantastic. On a side note, they sell a muscle and joint cream that's out of this world. My wife and I love generic CBD. It retails $100. On sale right now, $39.95. But you can try it out for free. Just pay $2.95 for the shipping. This penetrating cream melts right into your muscles and your joints, including your knees, your elbows, and your lower back. You won't believe how fast it goes to work. And it's a great moisturizer, too. Try it for yourself. You'll love it. And don't worry, it's not a subscription. Get your free sample at genericCBD.com. Get that sample headed your way right now. See what this cream can do for you. Get your free sample at genericCBD.com. That's genericCBD.com. These products and statements have not been evaluated by the FDA. These products are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease or illness. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I have to confess to you, I don't have a lot of billionaires on the radio. The only one I can think of that I've interviewed recently is named Trump. And he's not with us today. But I have another billionaire who's joined me, and that's John Katzimatidis, who is, well, he started out in the grocery business, working at a little grocery store at night to pay the bills for his parents, which is what every kid should try to do if they get the chance. And he ends up being one of the biggest grocery owners in the world, and a billionaire and a radio figure as well. So, John, you took a different approach to radio than I did. You bought the radio station. How are you, sir?
Well, Lars, I'm having a lot of fun, and that was the whole purpose of it. I grew up with WABC, and I remember Cousin Brucey back in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and when I bought WABC, the first person I hired, I said, I want Cousin Brucey back. And people love the guy. And this September 7th, and you're invited, we're having a special party for Cousin Brucey at Cipriani's in New York for his 60th anniversary in the industry, in the business.
Wow.
And you know what his talent is?
What?
He picks out the most beautiful songs every Saturday night when he's on. He's on with us at WABC between 6 and 10 on Saturday nights. and the selection of his songs are so beautiful. It brings us back to yesteryear. It brings us back and say, when that song was playing, who was I with? And it makes you feel glad you're alive, and that's why I stay home Saturday nights just listening to Cousin Brucey.
I'm talking to John Katzimatidis, who is the owner of the Red Apple Group, a major league grocery chain, but he owns WABC in New York. You want to buy CNN because you think the folks at CNN are not doing a very good job in recognizing where their opportunities are. Would you mind talking about that?
Well, what I said to CNN, I said to the people there, I know some of the principals, I said to them, look, you have 400,000 viewers. Big deal. I mean, for the whole country, 400,000 viewers is not a lot. I said, you want me to run CNN? I'll have it to 2 million within a year, and I'll write you a check if I don't have it at 2 million in a year.
That's a brilliant way. And you thought it was smart for somebody, well, the guy's now been fired, but you thought it was smart to have Donald Trump on the town hall at CNN, and they all of a sudden get rid of the guy who made it happen.
Well, they panicked for some reason. I don't understand. If I had 400,000 viewers, and in one night I had an individual, whether you like him or you don't like him, we're in the media business. And then they had 4 million people in one night, and instead of giving the guy a bonus, they fire him. I mean, tell me, the board of directors, there's something wrong someplace.
Well, there is something wrong there. And John Katzimatidis has written a book called How Far Do You Want to Go? Lessons from a Common Sense Billionaire. Would you mind giving my audience an idea of how'd you go from grocery stock boy at a night job helping out your folks to the owner of Red Apple Group? How did that happen?
Well, I was going to college. I had the congressional nomination for West Point. I ended up going to NYU and taking ROTC and them throwing the SDS throwing pies at me. I was working in a friend's grocery store, and in my senior year, he says to me, he was like a big brother to me. I was an only child. But he says to me, you got to take over the store. I'm arguing with my uncle every day, every night. You got to do it. And Tony, his name was Tony. I never said no to Tony. If I had a hot date and I wanted to borrow his Bonneville, he'd never say no to me. So I said, okay. So he says, take over 50% of the store and pay me $1,000 a month for 10 months. That's $10,000. The store is yours. Well, me and his uncle never had a fight in our lives. One of the things in my book is if partners making money, you'll never have an argument. If partners are not making money, you're going to argue every day. Page 255 in my book, and it has the art of being a success. You have to work hard, and you cannot be a success if you're constantly afraid of losing.
Yeah.
And I was not afraid of losing. I just did whatever the right thing was. We started in the grocery business, then we went on to the real estate business, we went on into the aviation business. The company that became NetJets, I started that company, and I flew all those jets.
You flew them? You flew on them, or you flew them?
I flew them. When I quit flying, I had 4,000 hours in jet time.
Wow.
And in those days, it wasn't as regulated as it is now. I used to fly all the way to Florida, 300 feet over the beach, all the way down.
Just for the view. Probably burned up a little more fuel than you would have otherwise, didn't it?
Yes, but fuel was cheap those days, and I used to say you get a real bird's eye view.
300 feet for sure.
Yeah,
and
by
the way,
a lot of sailboats started moving fast.
Yeah, no doubt. I'm talking to John Katzimatidis. His book is called How Far Do You Want to Go? Lessons from a Common Sense Billionaire. I want to ask you about this. There are a lot of people kind of stay in their lane. You were in the grocery business, Red Apple Group. You drop out of NYU. You didn't even get to graduation. You were 8 credits short. And then you get into all these different businesses. That sounds like the kind of dangerous behavior in business that sometimes gets people in trouble because, I remember GE way back when made washing machines and dryers and refrigerators, and then they got into theme parks and they kind of lost their shirt.
The difference? When
What?
Jack Welch was running it, the creator, the GE's very successful. The same thing with IT&T. The same thing with all the Gulf and Western, with all the conglomerates. When you cannot have an ordinary CEO take over a multifaceted company like that. It takes special talent to be able to zig and zag at the same time. And that's what it's about. My biggest profit was when I got back, I ran Capital Airlines. I lived in Smyrna, Nashville, Tennessee for 2 years. And I love Nashville. It was a great city. And I ran the airline. When I came back to New York, and the people we sold the airline to filed bankruptcy. And I went to the bankruptcy court. I ended up buying an oil company. And
you just aren't afraid. Is there any sector of the economy that you're afraid of or you wouldn't go into?
No, you can become anything you want in America. And, I'm an immigrant. America is the greatest country in the world. That's why all the immigrants are breaking down they're not breaking down the barriers anymore because they can just walk over the border over there down in Texas. And, I don't understand why we have people watching the airports. Terrorists are not coming through the airport. They're going to go down to Mexico and walk over. I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy with that. You talk about Donald Trump. I'm going to see him at 6:00 tonight.
Are you really?
You want me?
Well,
yeah.
Give him my best. Give him my
he's
best.
in New York. I will tell him me and you talked at 5 o'clock.
And tell him that to wear that indictment from the Biden DOJ like a badge of honor. That's John Katzimatidis, owner of the Red Apple Group, author of How Far Do You Want to Go? Lessons from a Common Sense Billionaire. We'll be back in a moment. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you on what we call Conspiracy Theory Thursday. Usually we visit with our friend Christian Toto, the host of Hollywood in Toto, the podcast. I want to talk about some of the new, the old school comedies out there. There's a brand new one called No Hard Feelings. But before we get to that, Kristen, welcome to the program. And tell me, how long do you suppose it's going to be before somebody pitches a script of the story of the submarine that we now know, unfortunately, catastrophically failed, killing all 5 people on board?
I hope it takes a while. It's certainly a story, and it's worth telling, and it's dramatic, and obviously the ending is not what we would hope for. But I feel like for the people involved, they don't need to see this movie right away, honestly. So I don't know, maybe, there was a recent movie by Ron Howard about children trapped in a Thai cave, and I think that one took a while before we saw it, in theaters. So I just think that maybe you need to kind of take a knee and take some time and let the process go through, and then maybe in a few years we can investigate what happened and hopefully learn some things.
I would hope so, too, because I also saw, and I think I sent it to you, some comments from James Cameron, who made the Titanic movie, and he was talking about how this failed, as they were going down to see the wreck of the Titanic, and then this thing failed. And it was also a vessel whose owner, whose CEO, who was on board and died in the implosion that apparently happened a couple of days ago. And they just located enough to tell how the end came. And they're saying that mercifully, at least, it was instantaneous. But he said he found it kind of haunting, the comparisons between the invulnerable Titan submarine, as it was described by the CEO of the company, and they also thought the Titanic was invulnerable and literally unsinkable, and it wasn't.
Yeah, history repeats itself. It's scary but true and inevitable. So, and Cameron isn't just a filmmaker. I mean, he's done a lot of deep sea expeditions. A lot of his documentary work has involved that. So he knows what he's talking about of these things, and he's not just an artist giving a hot take. He gets it.
I think you're right. Hey, let's talk about let's go from that to comedies. I know that's a tough transition, but old school comedies are kind of an endangered species these days because of the woke era. You know, you got to be politically correct, you got to have diversity, and now diversity is going to be forced on Hollywood. Tell me about this new movie, No Hard Feelings, and whether or not it's a winner or not.
You know, it sounded like a return to form. It sounded old school, and you could even say it sounds tacky. It's about a woman who is hired by parents to date their son. The son is 19, so he's of age, but he's very shy with girls. He's introverted. He stays home and plays video games. He's going off to college, and the parents say, wouldn't it be nice if he met a girl and maybe even dated her? And you can, insinuate what you want, because that is part of the story here. So Jennifer Lawrence plays the woman, and she is trying to seduce this younger gentleman and teach him the ways of the world. And again, you could say that's outrageous and bawdy, but that's the kind of stuff they used to do. And often it can be very funny. And Jennifer Lawrence is a wonderful actress, and I think she's very game here. But it's not that funny, and it's not that outrageous either. I think they took this concept that could have been crazy and off the wall, and they backed away a little bit. It's sort of sentimental at times. The story moves in different directions where it's kind of pulling its punches, I would say. So it's okay. I got a couple chuckles out of it. Again, she's very good in it. She's always a talented performer. But I was hoping for something old school. I was hoping for oh gosh, they don't make them like this anymore. Maybe they're coming back, but it didn't quite get there with No Hard Feelings.
Did you get a sense of why they pulled their punches? What did it have to do with trying to be politically correct and not make anybody angry? Or was it just they didn't write it very well?
I suspect it's both. It's actually, in the beginning of the film, there's a lot of woke asides. I thought, oh my gosh, not only is this not what I thought it could be, it's going in a different direction. But then it settles in. But it's really about two people going in different directions with their lives and how they are able to help each other. And there's nothing wrong with that. That could be a wonderful story. But I just think you've got to commit. You've got to go with the flow. You've got to say, hey, this is a raucous R-rated romp like they used to make, or this is a comedy that looks into the psyches of two different people and sees how they're unlikely to bond, but they do, that kind of thing. So I just think it's a lot of half measures. And again, the script isn't as good as it should be, and a lot of head scratching plot moves and character decisions that don't help at all.
I'm talking to Christian Toto. He's the host, of course, of the Hollywood and Toto podcast. Let me ask you this. The last couple of years I've been asking you, is Hollywood finally going to realize that being shoved into the woke box or the PC box or the diversity box is not going to end well? Like watching in a movie where you can say, don't walk into that house, the one with the, the scary stuff. And yet Hollywood never seems to wake up. Are there signs it's starting to wake up to what they've signed off on?
I think piece by piece in recent weeks, we've seen Tom Hanks and also Steven Spielberg speak out against censorship in books. And also more recently, Jennifer Lawrence, who we just talked about a second ago, she said it's getting harder and harder to make movies where someone isn't offended. So I think even she's acknowledging, hey, it's tricky to do those old school comedies because what if you say this joke, or what if you, demonize this organization, or it's just, there's so many little landmines you have to navigate. And also recently, Eva Longoria was talking about, hey, she was in Desperate Housewives. That movie made her a star. A TV show made her a star. And now she's saying, I don't even know if we could do that TV show today. It was so raucous. It was so rowdy. It was so unconventional. And I think that's her way of saying, I wouldn't even be here making movies anymore if the culture was the way it was, now as it was then. So I think some artists get it. I think most of them are still very afraid to speak out. And that's a shame because it is their livelihood. It is creativity. I think they could push the envelope in ways that would make better movies and better TV shows. But I don't think we're quite there yet.
I know, Christian, we've already talked about the movie Flaming Hot, and we've talked about the fact that, like a lot of movies, it maybe took too much literary license and told a story that wasn't true, but it was a cool story about this guy who comes up with flaming hot Cheetos and all that. She's the one behind that, and the film definitely leans conservative. It presents faith and family and hard work and all the rest of that. It's got a lot of victim stuff in it as well. But she was the one behind that movie, right?
Yeah, it is interesting. There's actually a slam against President Reagan mid-movie, which really comes out of nowhere and doesn't connect with the story that much at all. So, she is a progressive activist in Hollywood, and she's been at the DNC conventions. But if you're going to tell the story, it is about hard work. It is about faith. It is about not giving up, not surrendering to the victim mentality. And I don't think you can tell the story without acknowledging all those things. So good for her. I think as a storyteller, she got that message, and it really does convey on the screen, even if again. All the things didn't exactly happen the way they said.
Do you think then maybe we've seen the swing far left, far woke, far all that stuff, and then now we're starting to see the swing back, or is this just a head fake?
I think it's too soon to tell. Every time I get excited that there is a momentum shift in a different direction, I'm disappointed dramatically. So,
absolutely, that's Christian Toto. He's the host of the Hollywood and Toto podcast, and he is a conservative. I think I'm safe in saying that without getting him in trouble. Christian, thanks very much. I appreciate it. You've got the Lars Larson Show.